You killed my brother for nothing, Marcus Stone. The words hit him like a punch to the gut as he stood in the dusty main street of Willow Creek, 20 years of carefully buried secrets suddenly clawing their way to the surface. The woman facing him had emerald eyes that burned with fury and pain, eyes he'd seen before, though not on her face. Marcus felt the blood drain from his weathered features as he stared at the young woman who couldn't be more than 20 years old. Her auburn hair caught the late afternoon sun, and in her delicate features, he saw the ghost of another face, one that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. I don't know what you're talking about, meh, he said quietly, his calloused hand instinctively moving toward the Colt at his hip, though not in threat. Old habits from a lifetime of being the town's unwanted drifter died hard. Liar. The word cracked like a whip across the space between them. 20 years ago, you found something that belonged to my family, something precious, and because of your silence, my brother died believing he was worthless, that nobody wanted him. The few townsfolk on the street had stopped to watch the confrontation, their whispers carrying on the evening breeze. Marcus Stone, the solitary ranch hand who'd never quite belonged anywhere, was finally being called to account for something. But what? Caroline, stop this madness right now. Marcus turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley approaching, his star gleaming against his worn vest. Tom's face showed the strain of a man trying to keep peace in a town that thrived on gossip and old wounds. The young woman, Caroline, lifted her chin defiantly, and in that gesture, Marcus felt his world tilt sideways. He'd seen that exact same stubborn tilt 20 years ago, on a face much smaller and infinitely more helpless. No, Sheriff Bradley, this man needs to answer for what he's done, what he's hidden. Carolyn's voice trembled with barely contained emotion. My brother died 3 months ago, and before he passed, he told me everything. About the barn, about being found, about the man who saved his life but never claimed him. The words hung in the dusty air like smoke from a gunfight, and Marcus felt something inside his chest crack open. Something he'd sealed shut the night he'd made the hardest decision of his life. A decision that had cost him everything he'd ever wanted and saved everything he'd ever loved. 20 years earlier, the howling October wind had been Marcus Stone's only companion as he'd stumbled through the night toward the abandoned McKinnon barn, seeking shelter from both the storm and the town's judgment. At 28, Marcus was already considered a lost cause by most of Willow Creek's respectable folk. The son of a drunkard and a woman who'd run off when he was barely 10, he'd spent his life drifting from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work he could find and never staying long enough for anyone to look too closely at the scars on his back or the shadows in his dark eyes. The McKinnon place had been empty for 3 years, ever since old Dutch McKinnon had died and his children had moved back east. The barn offered 4 walls and a roof, which was more than Marcus had in most places he'd tried to call home. He'd been settling into the hayloft when he'd heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. A baby's cry, not the distant wail of an infant safe in some farmhouse, but the desperate, weakening cry of a child in distress, coming from somewhere inside the very barn where he'd sought refuge. Marcus had lived rough for most of his adult life. He'd seen men shot down in the street, watched cattle die in harsh winters, and buried more friends than he cared to count. But nothing had prepared him for what he'd found in that old grain bin. A tiny baby, probably no more than a few days old, wrapped in a blood-stained shawl and left to die in the cold October night. The infant's cries had grown weaker, his tiny face blue-tinged from the cold, and Marcus had known that another hour, maybe less, would have been too late. Jesus Christ, he'd whispered, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he'd lifted the fragile bundle. What kind of monster leaves a baby to die? But even as he'd asked the question, Marcus had known the answer. The kind of monster who was desperate, the kind who saw no other choice, the kind who might be watching from the shadows even now, ready to finish what they'd started if they thought their secret might be discovered. The baby had been so small, so impossibly fragile that Marcus had been afraid his calloused fingers might hurt him just by touching him. But the infant had quieted at his touch, tiny fist wrapping around Marcus's thumb with surprising strength. In that moment, in that cold barn with the wind howling outside, Marcus Stone had felt something he'd never experienced before. The desperate, overwhelming need to protect another human being, no matter what it cost him. He'd wrapped the baby in his own coat and made a decision that would haunt him for the next 20 years. The ride to Doc Henley's house had been the longest 3 miles of Marcus's life, with the baby pressed against his chest and his horse fighting the storm winds that threatened to knock them both from the saddle. Doc Henley had been the only man in town who'd ever treated Marcus with anything approaching kindness, perhaps because the old physician had seen enough of life's harsh realities to recognize that circumstances, not character, often determined a man's fate. Found him in the old McKinnon barn, Marcus had said simply when Doc Henley had opened his door to find the rain-soaked drifter holding a bundle that could only be one thing. Doc Henley hadn't asked questions that night. He'd simply taken the baby, examined him with gentle, experienced hands, and pronounced him healthy despite his ordeal. Someone wanted this child found, he'd said quietly, meeting Marcus's eyes. Leaving him where you'd be sure to shelter suggests someone knew your habits. The implication had sent ice through Marcus's veins. Someone had been watching him. Someone had known he'd choose that particular barn on that particular night. What happens now, Doc? Now, Marcus, we have some difficult decisions to make. Doc Henley had cradled the baby with the easy competence of a man who'd delivered half the children in Willow Creek. This child needs more than medical attention. He needs a family, a future. Marcus had stared down at the tiny face, peaceful now in the warm lamplight of Doc's kitchen. The baby had dark hair and what looked like it might become strong features, but it was impossible to tell much more than that. What Marcus could tell was that someone had sewn that blood-stained shawl with careful stitches, and that the cloth, though simple, was clean and well-made. There's something else, Doc Henley had said, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets. Judge Morrison and his wife have been trying for a child for 15 years. They've got more love than they know what to do with, and the means to give this boy everything he could ever need. Marcus had felt his heart clench. Judge Morrison was one of the most respected men in the county, honest and fair in his dealings, married to a gentle woman who taught Sunday school and was known for her kindness to anyone in need. They'd be good to him, Marcus had said, though the words felt like swallowing ground glass. The best. Doc Henley had studied Marcus's face in the flickering lamplight. But there's something you need to understand, son. If we do this, if we give this child to the Morrisons, it has to be complete. No looking back. No claiming him later. The boy deserves to grow up knowing he's wanted, not wondering if his real family might come back for him someday. Marcus had understood. A child given to the Morrisons would have every advantage: education, security, respect. A child raised by an outcast ranch hand would have only love. And in the harsh reality of the frontier, love didn't put food on the table or open doors that prejudice had slammed shut. The decision should have been easy, but as Marcus had looked down at that tiny face, he'd felt something break inside his chest, a pain deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. The next morning had brought complications that Marcus hadn't anticipated, beginning with the arrival of Sheriff Bradley at Doc Henley's back door before the sun had fully risen. "Heard you had some excitement last night, Doc," Bradley had said, his eyes immediately finding the makeshift crib where the baby slept peacefully. Word travels fast in a town this size. Doc Henley had tensed, and Marcus had felt his hand drift toward his gun. "What kind of word, Sheriff?" "The kind that says our friend Marcus here found something that doesn't belong to him." Bradley's tone had been carefully neutral, but his meaning was clear. "There's been some talk about a baby going missing from one of the homesteads south of town." Marcus had felt his world tilt. "Missing? You mean stolen?" "I mean gone, and folks are looking for answers." Bradley had moved closer to the crib, studying the sleeping infant. "Funny thing is, the description I'm getting doesn't quite match this little fellow. Different age, different coloring. Makes a man wonder if maybe there's more than one baby involved in all this." Doc Henley and Marcus had exchanged glances, both understanding the implications. If there was another missing child, then the baby Marcus had found might not be the one the searchers were looking for. But it also meant that someone, somewhere, might be looking for their child. Sheriff, Doc Henley had said carefully, this baby was abandoned, left to die. Even if someone comes forward claiming to be his parents, we'd have to ask ourselves what kind of people abandon an infant in a coal barn. That's not our decision to make, Doc. Bradley had lifted the baby with surprising gentleness, and the infant had stirred but not awakened. Our job is to make sure this child gets back to where he belongs. And if where he belongs is with people who tried to kill him, Marcus's voice had been rough with barely controlled anger. Bradley had studied Marcus with sharp eyes. That's a serious accusation, Stone. You got proof of that, or are you just assuming the worst? The truth was, Marcus had no proof of anything. Just a baby in a barn and a gut feeling that whoever had left him there hadn't expected him to be found alive. But gut feelings weren't evidence. And in a town where Marcus already walked the line between tolerated and unwanted, accusations without proof would only make things worse. I just think, Marcus had said slowly, that anyone who wants this child should have to prove they can take care of him. Fair enough. Bradley had handed the baby back to Doc Henley. I'll make some inquiries. Discreet ones. But Marcus, his tone had carried a warning. Don't get too attached. This isn't your decision to make. As the sheriff had left, Marcus had felt the walls of his carefully controlled world beginning to crack. 3 days of discreet inquiries had yielded nothing but questions and rumors, each more disturbing than the last. The missing baby Sheriff Bradley had mentioned turned out to be a 6-month-old who'd been taken by his own grandmother during a family dispute. Found safe 2 counties over with relatives who'd been trying to protect the child from an abusive father. Not connected to the infant Marcus had discovered, but the rumors about that infant had taken on a life of their own. Some folks claimed they'd seen a well-dressed woman in a fancy carriage near the McKinnon place the night Marcus had found the baby. Others swore they had heard tell of unmarried girls from prominent families being sent to visit relatives in distant towns, only to return months later looking thinner and sadder. Marcus had tried to stay away from town during those 3 days, but the walls of his small cabin had felt like a prison. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen that tiny face and felt those impossibly small fingers gripping his thumb. On the 4th morning, Doc Henley had arrived at Marcus's door with news that changed everything. Judge Morrison wants to meet with you, Marcus. Me? Why? Marcus had felt his stomach drop. I told you I'd step aside. The boy needs a good family, not what? Not a man who risked his own safety to save a child's life. Doc Henley had fixed Marcus with a stern look. Judge Morrison isn't a fool, son. He knows what kind of man pulls a dying baby from a coal barn and asks for nothing in return. The meeting had taken place in Judge Morrison's study, a room lined with law books and filled with the comfortable scent of leather and tobacco. Judge Morrison himself had been a tall, dignified man with kind eyes and graying hair, while his wife Elizabeth had been the sort of woman who made everyone feel welcome in her presence. Mr. Stone, Judge Morrison had said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. My wife and I have been discussing this situation, and we find ourselves in need of your counsel. Marcus had blinked in surprise. Nobody had ever asked for his counsel about anything. We want to adopt this child, Elizabeth Morrison had said, her voice gentle but firm. Give him our name, our home, every advantage we can provide. But we also believe that a child should know where he came from, should understand the circumstances that brought him to us. What my wife is saying, Judge Morrison had continued, is that we'd like you to be part of this boy's life, not as his father. That role would be mine and Elizabeth's, but as the man who saved him. The man who chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away. Marcus had felt the room spinning around him. I don't understand. We're offering you a job, Mr. Stone, as foreman of our ranch, a permanent position with a house on our land and a place in our family. Not charity, you'd earn your keep and then some, but it would mean you could watch this child grow up, could be the uncle he'd need when the world got too complicated for parents to handle alone. The offer had been more than Marcus had ever dared to dream, But it had also terrified him more than facing down a dozen armed men. "Why?" he'd whispered. Elizabeth Morrison had smiled, and in that smile, Marcus had seen the love that would surround the abandoned baby for the rest of his life. Because, Mr. Stone, families aren't just made by blood. They're made by choice. And you've already chosen this child once. The first year of the arrangement had tested everyone involved in ways none of them had anticipated, beginning with the challenge of explaining Marcus Stone's sudden presence in the respectable Morrison household. Judge Morrison had handled the town's curiosity with his characteristic directness. "Marcus Stone saved my son's life," he'd told anyone who asked. "That makes him family, and family takes care of family." The simple statement had been both true and deliberately incomplete, allowing people to draw their own conclusions while protecting the details of little James Morrison's origins. Most folks had assumed the baby had been the judge's own child, perhaps born to a relative who died in childbirth, and if they wondered why the normally forthcoming Morrison family had become closed-mouthed about the details, they'd been too polite to press. Marcus had thrown himself into his work with desperate intensity, transforming the Morrison Ranch from a modest operation into one of the most prosperous spreads in the county. He'd worked from dawn to dusk, pushing himself harder than any foreman should, driven by the need to prove he deserved the trust the Morrisons had placed in him. But the real test had come in the quiet moments, when little James had cried in the night, and Marcus had found himself standing outside the nursery, fists clenched with the effort of not going in. When the baby had taken his first steps, and Marcus had watched from the barn doorway, close enough to see, but far enough away to remember his place. When James had spoken his first word, "Papa," directed at Judge Morrison, and Marcus had felt something die inside his chest. Elizabeth Morrison had been the one to find him that evening, sitting alone in the barn with his head in his hands. "He's a beautiful child," she'd said, settling onto a hay bale beside him, with the easy grace that made her so beloved in the community. "Yes, ma'am, you and the judge are raising him well." "We are, but Marcus—" She'd waited until he looked at her, her eyes kind but uncompromising. "You're allowed to love him. In fact, I think it would be strange if you didn't. He's not mine to love. Love isn't about ownership. It's about commitment." Elizabeth had watched James toddle around the yard, chasing chickens and laughing with pure joy. "That little boy has 3 adults who would die for him. How is that anything but a blessing?" Marcus had struggled with the concept. In his experience, loving someone meant claiming them, protecting them, making them yours in the eyes of the world. The idea of loving from a distance, of being part of a child's life without being the center of it, required a kind of emotional sophistication he'd never had to develop. But as James had grown from a baby into a walking, talking toddler, Marcus had begun to understand what Elizabeth meant. The boy had clearly claimed all 3 adults as his own, showing no confusion about the roles they played in his life. Judge Morrison was Papa, the authority figure who set boundaries and taught lessons. Elizabeth was Mama, the source of comfort and gentle guidance. And Marcus was simply Marcus, the man who taught him to ride, who showed him how to care for animals, who told him stories about the frontier while they sat by the creek in the evenings. The arrangement had worked better than any of them had dared hope, creating a family that was unconventional but undeniably strong. Until the night everything had changed. James Morrison was 4 years old the night his world came crashing down, though he wouldn't understand the full impact until 16 years later, when a letter arrived that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. Marcus had been in the barn when he'd heard the horses approaching, 3 riders moving fast through the darkness, their urgency obvious even from a distance. He'd grabbed his rifle and stepped into the shadows, a lifetime of caution keeping him hidden while he assessed the threat. The lead rider had dismounted near the front porch, and in the moonlight, Marcus had recognized the silhouette of Sheriff Bradley. But the 2 men with him had been strangers, their Eastern clothes and pale complexions marking them as city folk unaccustomed to frontier life. "Judge Morrison," Bradley had called out, "sorry to disturb you so late, but we've got a situation that can't wait." Judge Morrison had emerged from the house in his nightshirt and robe, his face grave with concern. "What's happened, Tom?" "These gentlemen are from back east, Boston to be specific. They've got some questions about James." Marcus had felt ice form in his veins. In 4 years, no one had come asking questions about James Morrison's origins. The family had begun to believe they were safe from the past. What kind of questions? Judge Morrison's voice had carried the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to legal battles. The taller of the two strangers had stepped forward, removing his hat with nervous precision. Judge Morrison, my name is William Cartwright. This is my associate, Mr. Reynolds. We represent the estate of the late Margaret Cartwright of Boston. I'm not familiar with that name. You wouldn't be, sir, but we have reason to believe you might be familiar with her son, a child who would be about 4 years old now, with dark hair and strong features. A child who disappeared from Boston approximately 4 years ago. The words had hung in the night air like smoke from a gunfight, and Marcus had felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Judge Morrison had glanced toward the house, where Elizabeth and James slept peacefully, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Gentlemen, perhaps we should discuss this inside. With respect, Judge, we'd prefer to handle this matter officially. We have documents, birth records, witness statements, even a photograph of the child taken shortly before he disappeared. Cartwright had produced a leather portfolio from his coat. We also have reason to believe that the person responsible for the child's disappearance may be living on your property. Marcus had felt the rifle tremble in his hands. Somehow, after 4 years, the past had found them, found James, found him. What exactly are you accusing me of, Mr. Cartwright? Judge Morrison's tone had turned dangerously quiet. Not you, sir, but we have evidence that a man named Marcus Stone was in Boston 4 years ago, around the time young Michael Cartwright disappeared. We have witnesses who can place him near the Cartwright estate, and we have reason to believe he may have taken the child as part of some scheme to— That's enough. Judge Morrison's voice had cracked like a whip across the darkness. Mr. Stone is a valued member of my household, and I won't stand here and listen to unfounded accusations. They're not unfounded, Judge. Cartwright had opened his portfolio and extracted a photograph, holding it where the lamplight from the house could illuminate it. Is this the child you know as James Morrison? Even from his hiding place in the barn, Marcus had been able to see Judge Morrison's reaction. The way his shoulders had sagged, the way his hand had trembled as he'd reached for the photograph. The game was over. The photograph had been damning in its clarity, a formal portrait of a well-dressed woman holding a baby who was unmistakably James, taken in what was obviously a professional studio with all the trappings of wealth and privilege. Marcus had watched from the shadows as Judge Morrison had studied the image, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally devastation. The woman in the photograph is Margaret Cartwright, William Cartwright had explained, his voice gentler now that he could see the judge's shock was genuine. She was my client's daughter-in-law, married to his son Robert. Both parents died in a carriage accident 3 years ago, and my client has been searching for his grandson ever since. 3 years ago? Judge Morrison had looked up from the photograph, confusion evident in his expression. But James, the child we adopted, he's been with us for 4 years. Which would suggest he was taken when he was barely walking, probably around his first birthday. Reynolds, the second man, had spoken for the first time. We have evidence that Mrs. Cartwright became unstable after her husband's death. She left Boston with the child, claiming she was taking him to visit relatives, but she never arrived at her destination. Sheriff Bradley had cleared his throat uncomfortably. Judge, we're going to need to talk to Marcus Stone. These gentlemen have a warrant for his arrest on charges of kidnapping. Kidnapping? Judge Morrison's voice had risen in outrage. That's impossible. Marcus found James abandoned in a barn, nearly dead from exposure. He saved the boy's life. Or so he claims, Cartwright had said. But consider the alternative explanation, Judge. A desperate woman, perhaps mentally unstable, fleeing with her child. She encounters a drifter who sees an opportunity, take the child, disappear for a while, then find him somewhere convenient and claim to be a hero. What better way to ingratiate himself with a prominent family? Marcus had heard enough. He'd stepped out of the shadows, rifle lowered but still in his hands, his face set in the grim lines of a man who knew his time was up. You don't need a warrant, Sheriff, he'd said quietly. I'll come willingly. Marcus, no! Judge Morrison had started toward him, but Marcus had held up a hand to stop him. "It's all right, Judge. I knew this day might come." Marcus had looked toward the house, where a lamp had appeared in an upstairs window. Elizabeth, no doubt awakened by the voices. "Just take care of the boy. Whatever happens to me, he's innocent in all this." "So you admit it?" Cartwright had stepped forward, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. "You took Michael Cartwright from his mother?" Marcus had been silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the upstairs window where he could see James's small silhouette. The boy who had called him Marcus, who had followed him around the ranch like a faithful puppy, who had never questioned why he was the only child in their unconventional family. "I took a dying baby from a coal barn," Marcus had said finally. "If that baby was Michael Cartwright, then yes, I took him, and I'd do it again." "Even knowing he wasn't yours to take?" Marcus had met Cartwright's eyes steadily, especially knowing that. The admission had sealed his fate, but as Sheriff Bradley had stepped forward with the shackles, Marcus had felt something unexpected. Not regret, but a fierce, protective satisfaction that had carried him through what would prove to be the darkest period of his life. The trial of Marcus Stone had become the most sensational legal proceeding in Willow Creek's history, drawing newspaper reporters from 3 states and turning the small frontier courthouse into a circus of public opinion and legal maneuvering. The prosecution's case had been straightforward and damning. Marcus Stone, a known drifter with no permanent ties, had encountered Margaret Cartwright during her flight from Boston. Whether through violence or manipulation, he had taken her child, probably killing the woman in the process, and then concocted an elaborate story about finding the baby abandoned to cover his crime. The fact that Margaret Cartwright's body had never been found had only strengthened their narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor James Whitfield had argued, "we have here a man who admits to taking the child that didn't belong to him. He's had 4 years to perfect his story, 4 years to convince even respected members of our community that he was a hero rather than a kidnapper. But the evidence speaks louder than his lies." Marcus's defense attorney, provided by Judge Morrison despite the clear conflict of interest, had struggled to counter the prosecution's case. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that a man found a baby rather than stole him, when the only witnesses were dead or missing? The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source: Doc Henley's meticulous medical records. "Your Honor," defense attorney Samuel Pearson had announced on the 3rd day of testimony, "I'd like to call Doc Henley to the stand to discuss the condition of the child," when Mr. Stone brought him for medical attention. Doc Henley had taken the stand with the dignity of a man who had delivered half the county and buried the other half. His testimony had been precise and devastating. "The child was suffering from severe exposure and dehydration," Doc Henley had testified. "His core temperature was dangerously low, and he showed signs of prolonged neglect. Not abuse, mind you, but neglect. He hadn't been fed recently, hadn't been changed, and his clothing was inadequate for the weather conditions. In your professional opinion, doctor, how long had the child been without proper care?" "At least 12 hours, possibly longer. If Mr. Stone hadn't found him when he did, the child would have died within the hour." Prosecutor Whitfield had tried to discredit the testimony during cross-examination. "Doctor, isn't it possible that Mr. Stone simply waited to seek medical attention to make the child appear more distressed?" Doc Henley's response had silenced the courtroom. "Young man, I've been practicing medicine for 37 years. I know the difference between recent neglect and prolonged abandonment. That child had been left to Tom, and Marcus Stone saved his life. Anyone who says different is either a liar or a fool." But the most powerful testimony had come from an unexpected witness, James Morrison himself. At 4 years old, James had been too young to testify formally, but Judge Morrison had requested permission to make a statement on his behalf. The request had been highly irregular, but the presiding judge had allowed it under the unusual circumstances. "This child knows nothing of courts or legal proceedings," Judge Morrison had said, standing beside the small boy who clutched his hand with obvious trust. "But he knows love when he feels it. He calls Marcus Stone by name, seeks him out when he's frightened, and lights up whenever he sees him. Whatever happened 4 years ago, whatever crimes may or may not have been committed, This child sees Marcus Stone as family. That speaks to character in ways that legal arguments cannot. The jury had deliberated for 3 days, and when they had returned with their verdict, the courthouse had been packed beyond capacity. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom had erupted, but Marcus had felt no victory. Because while he'd escaped prison, the trial had accomplished exactly what William Cartwright had intended. It had established beyond legal doubt that James Morrison was actually Michael Cartwright, heir to a substantial Boston fortune. And that changed everything. The weeks following the trial had brought a new kind of torment. The slow, agonizing process of watching the only family Marcus had ever known prepare to lose the child who had bound them together. William Cartwright had been nothing if not thorough in pressing his client's claim. Within days of Marcus's acquittal, legal papers had arrived demanding the immediate return of Michael Cartwright to his grandfather's custody. The papers had been accompanied by detailed financial records showing the extent of the boy's inheritance, properties in Boston and New York, investments worth more than most frontier towns would see in a decade, and a trust fund that would ensure Michael never wanted for anything. Judge Morrison had fought the order with every legal weapon in his considerable arsenal, but the law had been clear. Blood relatives had rights that adoptive families, no matter how loving, could not supersede, especially when those blood relatives had vast financial resources and the best attorneys money could buy. "We have 2 weeks," Elizabeth Morrison had told Marcus as they'd watched James play in the yard, blissfully unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. 2 weeks to prepare him for a life we can't even imagine. "How do you prepare a 4-year-old for losing everything he's ever known?" Marcus had asked, his voice rough with barely suppressed rage. "You don't. You just love him as much as you can in the time you have left." Those 2 weeks had passed like a fever dream. Marcus had spent every available moment with James, teaching him skills he'd never need in Boston society, but that somehow felt important to pass down. How to read the weather in the clouds, how to approach a nervous horse, how to find direction by the stars. "Why are you teaching me so many things all at once, Marcus?" James had asked one evening as they'd sat by the creek, watching the water flow toward distant horizons. Marcus had struggled for words that would be both honest and gentle. "Sometimes, James, people have to go away, but the things they teach you, the love they give you, that stays inside you forever." "Are you going away?" "I might have to, but I want you to remember something, all right? No matter where you go or how long we're apart, you'll always be special to me. Always." James had considered this with the seriousness that only children could bring to weighty matters. "Will you remember me too? Every day for the rest of my life." The night before James was scheduled to leave for Boston, the Morrison household had gathered for what everyone knew would be their last dinner together. Elizabeth had cooked all of James's favorite foods, and Judge Morrison had presented the boy with a small leather journal. "For writing down your adventures," the judge had explained, his voice carefully controlled, "so you can remember all the good times we've had." James had accepted the gift with the pleased confusion of a child who sensed the adults were emotional, but didn't understand why. "Will you write in it too, Papa, and Mama, and Marcus?" "We'll write you letters," Elizabeth had promised. "Lots of letters, and maybe someday, when you're older, you can come visit us." But even as she'd made the promise, everyone had known how unlikely it was. Boston society would have no patience for a child's attachment to frontier folk, no matter how genuine the bonds had been. James Morrison would become Michael Cartwright, and in time, the boy who had chased chickens in a dusty ranch yard would be nothing but a half-remembered dream. That night, Marcus had stood guard outside James's bedroom, memorizing the sound of the child's breathing, storing up the memory of his safety and peace for the long, empty years ahead. The morning William Cartwright came to collect his client's grandson had dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made every detail painfully sharp and unforgettable. Marcus had watched from the barn as the elegant carriage had rolled up the drive, its polished surfaces and matched horses a stark reminder of the world James was entering. A world where Marcus Stone would be nothing but an embarrassing chapter in the boy's early history, quickly forgotten as proper education and social position worked to erase the rough edges of his frontier childhood. James had been dressed in his finest clothes, a small suit that Elizabeth Morrison had sewn with trembling fingers, working by lamplight through the previous night to ensure her boy looked respectable for his new life. The sight of him standing on the front porch, small hand clutched in Judge Morrison's larger one, had been almost more than Marcus could bear. "Remember what we talked about, James," Marcus had said as he'd approached the family group, his own voice steady despite the storm raging inside his chest. "You're going on a grand adventure, like the heroes in the stories. Will there be cowboys in Boston, Marcus?" "Different kinds of heroes, son, but heroes just the same." Cartwright had been accompanied by a woman this time, a stern-faced governess whose job would be to manage James during the long journey east, and then oversee his transformation from frontier child to Boston gentleman. She looked at the assembled group with barely concealed disdain, her expression making it clear what she thought of people who would allow a child to grow up in such rough circumstances. "Michael," she'd said, her voice crisp with authority, "my name is Miss Henderson. I'll be taking care of you during our trip. Say goodbye to these people now, please. We have a schedule to maintain." James had looked confused by the name, glancing up at Judge Morrison for explanation. "She means you, son," the judge had said gently. "Michael is another name you have, a grown-up name for your new life." The goodbyes had been agonizing in their brevity. Elizabeth Morrison had knelt and hugged James fiercely, whispering words of love and promises to remember him always. Judge Morrison had shaken the boy's hand with formal dignity, as if the child were already the young gentleman he was destined to become, and then it had been Marcus's turn. He'd knelt in the dust of the yard and looked into eyes that were still bright with curiosity, rather than the grief that would come later, when the full impact of this change became clear. "I want you to have this," Marcus had said, pulling a small carved wooden horse from his pocket. "I made it for you, so you'd always remember the ranch. Remember us." James had accepted the gift with the pleased surprise of any 4-year-old receiving a toy. "It looks like thunder. Will you make one for yourself so you can remember me too?" "I don't need a wooden horse to remember you, James. You're carved right here," Marcus had tapped his chest, "where nobody can take you away." As the carriage had pulled away, James had pressed his face to the rear window, waving frantically until distance swallowed the small figure. Marcus had stood in the yard long after the dust had settled, staring at the empty road and feeling something die inside his chest that he'd never been able to resurrect. That night, he'd packed his few belongings and ridden away from the Morrison Ranch, leaving behind the only real home he'd ever known, and the family that had accepted him when no one else would. Judge Morrison had protested, Elizabeth had wept, but Marcus had known the truth. Without James to bind them together, there was no reason for him to stay. He'd become a drifter again, moving from ranch to ranch, carrying the weight of love and loss like a physical burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Until today, 20 years later, when a young woman with emerald eyes had confronted him in the street and called him a liar. Now standing in the dusty street of Willow Creek with the weight of 20 years pressing down on him, Marcus Stone finally understood what Caroline Cartwright had come to tell him. "Your brother died believing he was worthless because I never claimed him," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're wrong about one thing, miss. I didn't keep silent to hurt him. I kept silent to protect him." Carolyn's green eyes, so like James's had been, flashed with fury. "Protect him? You let him grow up thinking he was unwanted, that nobody had ever loved him enough to fight for him. I let him grow up believing he belonged to the finest family in Boston," Marcus replied, his hands trembling with the effort of keeping his voice steady. "I let him have education, culture, opportunities I could never have given him. I let him become the man his grandfather wanted him to be. A man who never knew where he came from. A man who spent his whole life wondering why he felt different, why he never fit in with Boston society, no matter how hard he tried." Carolyn's voice cracked with grief. "He used to have nightmares, you know, dreams about a barn, about being cold and afraid. The doctors said it was impossible. He was too young to remember, but he remembered anyway." Sheriff Bradley stepped between them, his weathered face showing the strain of watching old wounds torn open. "Caroline, this isn't helping anyone, isn't it?" She turned on the sheriff with blazing eyes. "Isn't it time the truth came out? Michael, James, whoever he was supposed to be, He never got to choose his own life. His grandfather made him into what he wanted, but he was never happy, never at peace. Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. What happened to him? Caroline's anger crumbled into grief. Consumption. Same as killed our mother. He fought it for 2 years, but she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Before he died, he made me promise to find the truth about his early years. He remembered fragments. A man who taught him about horses, a woman who made him feel safe, a judge who called him son. He wanted to know if it had been real or just fever dreams. It was real, Marcus said softly. All of it. He was the most wanted child in the world, Carolyn. 3 adults who would have died for him, each in our own way. Then why didn't you fight for him? The question came out as a broken whisper. Why didn't anyone fight for him? Marcus looked around at the faces watching them. Townspeople who remembered the trial, who remembered the little boy who'd been lost to Boston society in a world they couldn't reach. Because sometimes loving someone means letting them go, he said finally. James had a chance at a life I could never give him. Money, education, position in society. How could I take that away from him just to keep him close to me? But he needed you, Caroline's voice rose again. He needed to know he was loved for who he was, not what his grandfather wanted him to become. He needed to know that someone had chosen him, had wanted him just because he existed. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering that last morning 20 years ago. The small hand in his, the wooden horse, the promise to remember. I did choose him every day for 4 years and every day since, but Caroline... He opened his eyes and met her gaze. What would you have had me do? Start a legal battle I couldn't win? Force him to grow up poor when he could have been rich? Take him away from opportunities that would shape him into a man of substance? I would have had you love him enough to let him know you existed. Carolyn's voice was softer now, but no less intense. He carried your wooden horse until the day he died, did you know that? 37 years old, one of the richest men in Boston, and he slept with a carved toy horse under his pillow because it was the only proof he had that someone had once cared about him. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of sacrifice, all his careful distance and noble suffering, he'd never considered that his silence might hurt more than his presence ever could have. He left something for you, Carolyn continued, reaching into her satchel. A letter. He dictated it to me just before he died, made me promise to deliver it if I ever found you. Marcus's hands shook as he accepted the sealed envelope, his name written across it in unfamiliar feminine handwriting. Caroline's hand recording her brother's final words. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and read, Marcus Stone, if that's still your name, I don't know if my sister will ever find you, but I hope she does. I want you to know that I remember. Not everything, but enough. I remember safety and kindness and feeling like I belong somewhere. I remember a man who taught me that being gentle didn't make you weak, and that protecting someone sometimes meant sacrificing everything for them. I became successful in business, respected in society, everything my grandfather wanted me to be. But I was never happy because I could never quite figure out where I belonged. It wasn't until I was dying that I understood. I belonged with the people who chose to love me, not the people who were obligated to claim me. Thank you for saving my life, Marcus. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. But next time, if there is a next time, if there's another child who needs choosing, love them enough to let them know they're chosen. That knowledge might mean more than all the advantages in the world. Your boy, always, James. By the time Marcus finished reading, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks, and he didn't care who saw them. 20 years of carefully maintained distance, 20 years of believing he'd done the noble thing, and it turned out the child had needed to know he was loved more than he'd needed to be protected from that love. He forgave me, Marcus whispered. More than that, Carolyn said, her own tears flowing freely now. He understood you, and he wanted you to understand that the 4 years he spent with your family were the happiest of his life. He never forgot Judge Morrison's laugh, or Elizabeth Morrison's lullabies, or the way you used to let him follow you around the ranch. Marcus looked up at the crowd that had gathered, seeing familiar faces from 20 years ago, people who had watched a small boy torn away from the only family he'd known, people who had understood even then that sometimes the law and justice were two different things. "I need to visit some graves," he said quietly. "Judge Morrison died 8 years ago, and Elizabeth followed him 2 years later. They're buried in the church cemetery, and I never said goodbye properly. I was too ashamed." "Then let's go say goodbye," Carolyn said, surprising him. "All of us together, the family that chose to love him." As they walked toward the small cemetery on the hill, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding that love, even imperfect love, even love that makes mistakes, was still the most important thing in the world. And sometimes when you were very lucky, love got a second chance. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Wild West, where love knows no boundaries and families are forged by choice, not just by blood. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that remind us it's never too late to choose love.